This time on Poll Hub, our brand new national poll with NPR and the PBS NewsHour has good news for almost everyone, meaning in a binary political system, it has bad news for almost everybody too. We're going to go behind the numbers that you have seen this week to explore what the data says about where we are right now, especially in politics. Then Philip Bump from the Washington Post joins to help us unpack a trend that may be unfolding, and that, if it does, will break historical precedents. It's part of the 714 boomers versus us stories that we see every day. We'll talk about that, and we finish with a fun fact from the prehistoric and Hollywood eras. Ooh, intrigued. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Athen Hollis. I'm Rebecca Hendricks.
And I'm Lee Marigoff.
Well, welcome, everyone. We have a new national poll out this week. The pollster elves have been very busy back from spring break.
Is that what we call
do elves go on?
elves?
No, I don't know. We actually call them survey assistants.
Yes.
So that's the more appropriate name. But I don't know. I kind of envisioned everybody on the beach the last couple of weeks in one way or the other. But we do have a poll out this week with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour. And we have several interesting findings and some pretty worth watching. Just to top it off, Biden and Trump are still very competitive. Biden in this poll is plus 2 points over Trump, 50% to 48%. And these are national registered voters that we spoke with. Not surprisingly, but this is something that has been going back and forth a bit. Trump, 52%, is plus 7 percentage points over Biden among independents. There's also a couple of other quirky things in this poll. I'd like to dig right in. Lee, do you want to?
Great. You throw me the quirks. That's great.
Well, it is the quirks, because I think there are some very interesting differences in this poll. And we have, it's not that it's different from what we have been seeing, but it's different, I think, from the conventional wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. So the conventional wisdom is that this race is locked solid between Biden and Trump, that everybody knows where they're going to go, and they know where they're going to vote, and they know who they're going to vote for and all that. And then what this poll says is that, 60% seem to fit in that category, that nothing will change their mind. But roughly 4 in 10 say they could still be persuaded one way or the other on this. And I think the second part of that is equally surprising, is that 63% of Biden supporters compared to 59% of Trump supporters say their vote is solid. So two things. More votes are up for grabs, and Biden is not so far off the pace. In fact, he's numerically ahead of Trump, and his folks are at least as firmly committed to him as Trump's are to Trump, and maybe even a little more so. And we saw in this poll also, his approval rating, Biden says, kind of notched up a couple points, and as his favorable rating. Bottom line, he's had a pretty good month, and Trump's numbers have pretty much been stationary. So much more of a campaign here still to be waged.
So, Jay, tell us a little bit about your observations. Is this poll just wacko? We got too much sand between our ears during spring break.
I don't know where you went, Barb. I didn't see much sand.
I didn't either. What's interesting to me is that a couple of major polls, us, Quinnipiac's another one, have been showing Biden closer with a lead for some time, and some other major polls, and these are all good polls, have been showing Trump with a lead for some time. And then there's some outlier polls that show Trump with giant leads, or I don't know that there are any that have Biden with giant leads. So I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that people see these and go, oh, well, the polls are wrong. And the fact is that this far out from an election, what we've shown here with this group of voters who are kind of persuadable is that when you ask this question now, two pollsters can get pretty different answers, not 20 points apart, but you're going to get different answers because people aren't there. They're not going to the polls next week to make this decision. They, in general, and I'm speaking very broadly, nobody loves these two guys. Not too many people love these two guys. There's certainly a group of hardcore MAGA people who love Trump, and there are people who love Joe Biden. But the broad cross-section of Americans, they don't necessarily love these guys. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing, but it does raise this issue, what's interesting to me, of why we're seeing some different results from different pollsters. The other thing stands out to me, again, with these so-called persuadables, is the third-party candidate. So in the past, when you've had persuadables, when you had John Anderson on the ballot in 1980, or you had Ross Perot on the ballot in 92 and 96, you can go back further when George Wallace was on the ballot. There have been people who have voted for them because they didn't like the choices. 1980, I think, is a pretty good example. Nobody really loved what Jimmy Carter had done. And while there are a lot of people who liked Ronald Reagan, there are a lot of people scared of Ronald Reagan. And John Anderson, it's not like he got 20% of the vote. He got a small percentage of the vote in the single digits. But that's what I'm looking at here. Is this a John Anderson, or is it more of a Ross Perot kind of year for a third-party candidate? And I think our numbers suggest that it might be more of a Ross Perot, maybe. But then Donald Trump's a bit of a wild card. He's not exactly George Bush, Bob Dole, or Bill Clinton.
We did follow up, and we did add some third-party candidates to the binary two-candidate question. We provided a choice of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, the independent, and then the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. What I found interesting is even adding that multi-candidate field, it didn't really change the dynamics of the race very much. Biden still receives 43% and Trump 41%. Obviously, they both dropped, but there's still 2 points showing a very competitive race between the two. What I did find interesting, though, was when, Lee, you talk about that group of voters that say, well, I sort of know who I'm voting for, but talk to me about it. I could switch to another candidate. And the 12% who have not made up their minds, that's who these independent candidates are also attracting. RFK Jr. gets 11% overall. Cornel West and Jill Stein kind of squeak by with 1% and 2%. But when we drill down and we look at independents, that's where we see some differences. Trump is still leading Biden among independents, but Kennedy, for instance, gets 1 in 5 independents. 21% say that they are thinking about, supporting him. One of the other things, though, that I did find interesting in this poll, which kind of throws the conventional wisdom upside down, is there does seem to be, I know this isn't a technical term, but sloshing around with what are considered to be the base of support for Joe Biden and even for Donald Trump. We see a change among young people, and those of you who are in the work world who are feeling a little bit older, we're defining younger voters as those under 45. We see a bit of a change among voters of color, and we also see a bit of change among white voters and who their support is. What's going on here?
Well, I think it's very interesting, and I think it really points to what Jay said. This is a campaign that still has to get much more definition. But yeah, right now, Joe Biden, who had 41% of the white vote 4 years ago, right now is clocking 48%. So he's actually doing better among white voters, but not as well among people of color. And so I think that this suggests, to Jay's point, that there's an unhappiness with a lot of people. And so there's not an automatic, there's not a given here. And we're going to have to see how that plays out. I do also think that when it comes to the Robert Kennedy and other minor party numbers, those supporters feel a lot of pressure in the fall when they think my candidate really isn't going to make it and I'm not going to get any electoral votes. So will I still vote for that person? And to answer the question, which I think is very important, and a lot of people want to know, does the Robert Kennedy candidacy or the others, who does it take more from? And again, there's a conventional wisdom that Joe Biden doesn't want Robert Kennedy around on the ballot, and yet the numbers suggest that doesn't really make a difference all that much between Trump and Biden. So again, on one hand, people think this race is already baked, and yet it really isn't. The cement is not dry, and we're still going to have to see how this plays out.
I do think there's one thing I want to just mention because it got a lot of play is a number that's not a big number, but I think it's a scary number. And it was a question we asked a bunch of different questions about things, issues. One of them is Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. Do you agree with that or disagree, strongly agree, or whatever? And there has been some play in the fact that 28% of Republicans said they agree with that statement. I think it's not a big number, 28%. It's a significant number, but it's not a big number. And I think when you compare that to the majority of Americans in the Democrat that say they're Democrats, they're Republicans, and they're independents, that say the American dream is still attainable, I think there are a lot of things under the covers here. And I would hate to focus too much on some of the scary ones. I think it's worth noting, but I do think there's some positive news in here too about the American electorate at this point, despite what we clearly see is not a lot of love for anything that's going on right now.
Yes, Jay, absolutely. That's a really good point. We asked quite a number of issues. They were more than just issues. I think they also tapped into a lot of values that voters have about politics and about the candidates and just what they think of the country as a whole. And certainly something that I think we should dig down into in future episodes. So in the meantime, I certainly suggest people take a look at that because there are definitely some very interesting differences and consensus.
I was going to grovel and also say, go to our website, take a look at the numbers. Good issue stuff here.
It is very interesting, and we break it down in some very informative ways.
And so let's switch gears. We want to talk about something we have talked about on this show before, and with a guest who we've had on before, who is one of our favorites. It's about generations, specifically the boomers and Gen Z, two very large generations that have had some very different behaviors of these big generations. So first, the guest, Philip Baum from the Washington Post. Thanks for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here.
So Gen Z is 38% of voters, 18 to 25. This is Gen Z, have identified as people of color. That compares with 32% of millennials, 28% of Generation X, Gen X, and 21% of boomers. So there's this diversity thing that is very different in Gen Z. And then there's the political thing about Gen Z. And according to Pew, voters under the age of 30 have been largely Democratic since President Barack Obama. He won 2/3 of that age group in 2008. And there's a lot of talk about whether this generation, these younger voters, are going to stay liberal. Boomers did not. They got more conservative as they got older. Gen X is the most conservative in most of our polls. Let's start there. You have written about the generations in your book, The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom and the Future of Power in America. We actually had you on to talk about that a while back. What is your take on this question about whether Gen Z will be different than the last giant generation, which is the boomers?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this in sort of two phases. The first is prior to the 2024 election, and then in the context of the 2024 election. So prior to the 2024 election, and particularly as I was writing my book, I realized, as any pollster will attest, that the social science research on this really isn't that old. It's hard to talk about what happens with generations over time, in part because we've only been doing this research, less than a century. In the generations obviously incorporated a large percentage of a century. So it's hard to say what happens to generations as they get older consistently. There's sort of this trope that as people get older, they become more conservative. We saw baby boomers generally do that. They were very liberal and now are much more moderate. They're not necessarily conservative. So we do have that one data point. But it's hard to say, given the short history that we have to look at, whether or not that's going to hold. And there are certainly some reasons why it may not. In addition to younger generations being more diverse, being more heavily non-white, they are also more college educated. They are less religious. There are all these other factors that come into play when we talk about what that overlap with partisan identity. And so the question is, as a more heavily non-white population gets older, is it too going to get more conservative, or will it, like, for example, older Black voters remain more heavily Democratic? That's sort of the question. So far, what we've seen is that they have the younger voters, even as they've gotten older, the group of younger voters has remained much more liberal in terms of its identification. So now we come to 2024, which I think is a very interesting election. We see polling now that shows younger voters, they did start to shift much more heavily pro-Democratic candidates, not only in 2008, where the gap really widened, but even in 2004, we started to see this sort of stretching, that younger voters were more heavily Democratic than older voters. 2008, they'd really yawned wide open and has remained fairly consistent since. 2024, though, we're seeing polling suggest younger voters are more evenly split between Biden and Trump. And I think, this is speculative, but I think part of this is rooted in the fact that younger voters are less institutionally aligned. right? And so we know that they're less religious. I said that a second ago. They're more broadly less aligned with institutions, including political parties. Younger voters are much more likely to identify as independents than members of parties. And so that means the Democratic Party can't rely as heavily on younger voters to just see that D on the ballot line and vote with it. And so in general, that's what they do. In general, younger voters, even independents, lean Democratic, tend to vote more heavily for Democrats. But there's a difference between going to a ballot and approaching it with, gubernatorial candidates and city council candidates and seeing the D and making that association, and Joe Biden, about whom they have strong feelings, right? And so it isn't necessarily the case that younger voters are suddenly shifting hard right and endorsing MAGA policies and pro-Trump. It is instead that they're facing a presidential election in which they know both candidates well and don't particularly like either one of them and do not feel committed to the Democratic Party and having to vote for Democratic politicians. It also may be the case that when we get to November, they come back on board and vote heavily for Biden if they vote at all, which is the real issue, I think, for the Biden campaign. But I think that's sort of what we're seeing. And I don't think that changes the core liberal policy preference that younger voters continue to have. It's just a manifestation of the fact that they don't particularly like Joe Biden.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the notion also of the referendum of abortion on the ballot in a lot of places and what that's been doing. And I'm thinking what you just said, if they vote at all, and I'm thinking that maybe it isn't Biden, maybe it won't be Trump that attracts them or turns them off, but maybe it's an issue like that, which becomes a connection point for them that then becomes a motivator. I was also curious about, would you also think that the polling that suggests that people of color may be not as solid for Biden as part of the same pattern that we're seeing? Or
that is tricky. And I think that there are a few things at play here. One is that, I think there are differences between the Black and the Hispanic population. The Hispanic population, there's been some research showing why the Hispanic population shifted to the right in 2020 relative to 2016, including the salience of immigration on the ballot that year and how, it wasn't a big year in which immigration was a big issue. But that we still see Gallup polling, for example, has shown, not to tout a competitor, obviously, but Gallup polling has shown that the Hispanic party identification has shifted to the right. Black identification is interesting, and I mentioned this in the book, and there's been some research since, including that I've written about for the Washington Post, that suggests that, again, institutions play a role here, in particular the institution of the Black church, and that younger Black Americans are less likely to be members of organized congregations, and as such lack that sense of community and social coherence around politics, right? So older Black Americans, it's certainly the case that they experience the civil rights movement, or are more likely to have experienced the civil rights movement, and experience the racism that the civil rights movement was trying to address, and things along those lines. But it is also the case that they are more regular churchgoers, and they're part of those communities, and that there is that social reinforcement of identity, including political identity, that younger Black Americans who don't go to church as often and who are more likely to be independent, registered as independents than older Black Americans, that may also be playing a role. I think that we are at a point, the entire predication of my book is that we're at this pivot point in American politics culture, and we're in the middle of the pivot point. And so I don't think we know the answers to this now. But I think we certainly do have some clues that we can point to.
So we have two pivoters with us, two of our producers who are both Gen Z. Athen, is this perception that your generation is going to potentially stay liberal, but as Phil points out, there's not a lot of history to make any big decisions on. But what is your perception of that? And what do you think? What questions do you have for Phil?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up the lack of, for younger people, the lack of connection spaces. For older Americans, it's like churches and other activities. But I'm really noticing with younger generations, there's nothing really like that. And especially post-pandemic, we've lost kind of a lot of that. So I feel like political spaces have really moved online. And I don't know if that's really part of it, but I think, at least for me, get a lot of, for activism, political spaces, and a lot of my friends, that has moved online for us. And I'm wondering if you see that as a part of it, as Gen Z and younger generations, we're finding our sense of politics and our voice in that space online, if that is having a big effect.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And I think as you were asking your question, I realized something that I want to write about more broadly, which is that the decay in institutional power. And, when we talk about organizing, when we talk about people being involved in things, it's very easy to get people involved in movements online. It's very easy to get them to tweet, to sign up for things, to, sign on to petitions. It is hard to maintain that as an institutional base of power. And by institution, I mean like an established body, something into which you can have power aggregated over time. And so it's easy to engage people and stuff on TikTok and on Twitter and on, whatever it happens to be. It's easy to get them to show their support or to learn about an issue. It is hard, however, to keep them involved in something and then deploy their power towards another purpose. And so I think that when we talk about the decline in institutional participation, we're talking too about a decline in the ability of institutions to aggregate power and deploy power. And as such, it's not just about party politics, but other organizations as well. And I think that then dilutes the power of the people that are organizing online because they don't have a way to manifest that power over the long term. I think that's really important. I also think it's important to note, as we talk about this issue, the distinction between ideology and party, right? The Republican Party could tomorrow change its positions in a way to try and appeal to Gen Z and Gen Alpha or whoever comes after, right? I mean, they could just simply change their policy. They could be like, yeah, actually now we support abortion, and we support trans issues, and we support climate change, and we support gun control. They could do that. Like, that's different than ideology. And so as we talked about what happens with these generations over time, it's important we differentiate between, they may maintain the same policy issues, but they may end up being Republicans, in part because the Republican Party or the Democratic Party may change in a way that they find appealing or unappealing.
Yeah, that's fair. Rebecca, you're also Gen Z. What's your thinking on this?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring up party affiliation in association with Gen Z. And I was wondering if you see a shift in Gen Z going away from that kind of majorly associating with either Republican or Democrat. In that dichotomy, do we see a greater diversity of political affiliation and political ideology, or are they still majorly falling into those two camps?
So when we talk about party identity, we tend to talk about sort of five groups, right? There's Democrats and there's Republicans, there's independents. When we talk about independents, though, most independents, like usually 90% of independents, are either independents who always vote with Democrats or independents who always vote with Republicans. And the difference between those groups is Democrats are Democrats and like the Democratic Party. Independents who tend to vote Democratic are independents who don't really like the Democratic Party but really hate the Republican Party. Then you have the pure independents who are either. You have independents who lean Republican and they hate the Democrats, and then you have Republicans who are Republicans and like the Republican Party. So you have those five groups. And so what we see is that most younger Americans, I should say the plurality, because I can't say most off the top of my head, but the plurality of younger Americans identify as independents, are not members of party, but are independents who lean Democratic and who tend to vote with Democratic candidates. And so that's exactly the divide I'm talking about, that the distinction between participation in the institution, but still having allegiance with the ideals and policies of that institution, in this case, that being the Democratic Party.
To what degree would you agree with me? So I'm the boomer. I'm the boomer on the team.
That's a kind of a trick question there, Lee.
Yeah.
To what degree would you agree with me? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
on sports, not at all, but otherwise,
yes, I know that. I know that. So I was active, and came of age during the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, all those kinds of things. And we sort of know what's happened to my generation. But is it partially like when you are socialized into your politics, like the Reagan kids?
Right.
What happened to them? Are they still conservative? The Obama kids, I think a part of, just from teaching over these decades, I've seen differences in young people depending on sort of when they came through the high school years. And certainly I feel like I'm talking in class very much to the Obama youth, because that's sort of where they were oriented. And then things kind of got a little weird with Trump for them. And now they're left with Biden and they're not totally comfortable with that. So to what degree is this a time, not necessarily of age, but when you become connected to your politics?
So there's research that I cite in the book from a team at, I believe, Columbia, that looked at the relationship between party identity and presidential approval at certain ages. And what they found is between the age of 14 and 24, historically was the period during which if you had a president of a party that was popular, you tended to align with that party. If you had a president of a party that was unpopular, you tended to align with the opposite party. And so that was the pattern. They actually show this curve that between 14 and 24, it's really formative. And then you can still be influenced later in life, but it has much less of an effect what the presidential approval rating is. And so when I spoke with the researchers, when I was researching the book back in 2021, so 3 years ago now, they pointed out that one of the reasons we had this, younger people who had this identity was that, Obama was very popular among younger Americans and Trump was not, and George W. Bush was not. And so, that was sort of defining where they were then. But that was right at the outset of Biden. So now we have Biden, and Biden's unpopular. So what does it mean then to have a very unpopular Trump and a very unpopular Biden? Biden's still very unpopular among younger Americans. How does that shape what's going to happen moving forward? It's hard to say, but that time period has been shown, at least in this one set of research, 14 to 24, as being the formative period in someone's life.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question before we let you go, because it gets at this young people not liking Trump or Biden, but aligning ideologically, not necessarily politically, but ideologically with Biden and the Democratic Party. How much of this has to do with the fact that we have two aldacakas running? I mean, we got two really old guys. If either party were to put up somebody who was maybe not Gen Z, but maybe a millennial, somebody who was like 40 or 45, somebody pretty young, how much could that realign Gen Z and even millennial voters?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure we know the answer to that. My speculation would be that it probably wouldn't have much of an effect. I don't think that if Donald Trump were 40, that he would be doing substantially better among younger voters. Sincerely, I don't think that's the issue, right? You have all these hard right, young dudes like Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk's not that popular among young people. He's popular among donors who are middle-aged, right? You have these groups that try and do that. So I do think it's the policy. Really the question here is, this group of voters who will go out and who don't like Biden, who don't like Trump, that'll probably be what decides this election. And the question for Biden is, can they at least get out young people who don't really like him but support his policies generally to come out and vote? Or are young people going to look at Biden and just be like, it's not worth it? I don't see a difference on issues like Gaza. On these big picture issues, yes, we talk about abortion, but then there are countervailing issues on which they really, really dislike Biden and what he's doing, may see no difference between Biden and Trump on foreign policy issues, which is something that's very, motivates them strongly. That's really, I think, probably the worry for the Biden administration, for the Biden reelection campaign is, will these people come out and vote at all? Because we know that older Americans who are more in the habit of voting vote more frequently. If they dislike both candidates, they're going to come out and vote. Younger people, that may not be the case. And I don't think that's, if Joe Biden too, or Pete Buttigieg, who is much younger, he's still not young, but he's if Pete Buttigieg were doing what Joe Biden is doing in Gaza, I think the response would be the same from younger Americans, just to use Gaza as an example.
Yeah. Fair point. All right. Philip Bump from Washington Post, also the author of The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom and the Future of Power in America. And our favorite Washington Post columnist, don't tell Aaron or anybody else we said that, but you're our favorite by far.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming
you guys,
on,
of course, are my favorite pollsters. So.
Isn't this a kumbaya conclusion?
It's the Mutual Love Society right here on Poll Hub, and it's good to be here. Anyway, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks.
Okay, so fun fact time. Has Jurassic Park confused science? Well, what are we talking about here? So the question was asked by YouGov in 2015. Do you believe that dinosaurs and humans once lived on the planet at the same time? Aha. So definitely 14%, probably 27%. That's 41 if you combine it. Probably not 18, definitely not 25. That's 43%. And 16% said, gee, I just don't know. I wasn't alive at the inception of both of those groups. That's not what they said, but that was what I added on to that. So this surprises you? I'm surprised how many people think they were living on the planet at the same time. I think that was interesting.
Did you have to look up the answer?
Well, no, it was offered to me by our STAR team of students. The earliest ancestors of humans have only been on the planet for 6 million years, while the last dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, which means roughly there's a 60 million year gap in this, which is a long time in our age group. But anyway, so what does that surprise you that so many people think that this was all happening at the same time?
No, because on the one hand, yes, I know that the science tells us that important fact that there was millennia between when dinosaurs and humans were on the earth. But yeah, I kind of think it's cool. I mean, I've always loved dinosaurs, and I think all the movies that we've had with dinosaurs, I kind of always wanted to have a flying dinosaur, and I think my heart would have liked to have been living when dinosaurs were marching around.
How about when they come running at you? I mean, I would think your attitude would change.
But I'd have my protector. I'd have my protector dinosaur.
Jay, would you go out there by yourself?
No, I would not go out there by myself. So I think what's kind of interesting about my initial reaction was, oh my gosh, people are really just not, And then I realized that if you asked me or I'm thinking of any of us about other moments in world history, I mean, the Earth's been here for 4 billion years, and billion years is not something that we can conceive of. I just don't think we have the capacity to conceive of what 1 billion years is versus 100 million versus even 1 million years. I mean, I barely remember what I ate for lunch yesterday. So I think what's interesting to me about this is my initial reaction was, wow, people just, come on. And then my other is that there are so many things about the Earth and Earth science and the time scale of the Earth and even humanity that I would get wrong. I mean, so many that I kind of think that you get a pass if you think that dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time, because there's so many things that all of us would get wrong about the timeline of the Earth.
Interesting. Well, maybe I should have teased it and said, we're not going to provide that answer, but tune in next week and we'll let you know whether your next door neighbor could have been a dinosaur or not.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis and Rebecca Hendricks.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.